Hello, welcome once more to Transformation of the Global System. I am Dr. Nicole Warmington Granston. Today, we'll be discussing theories of global politics. So, we'll first start off by looking at liberalism and realism, right? Because these are theories that are used to explain international relations. So, we'll talk about what are theories, how they explain global politics, and we'll talk about the key differences between realist and liberal perspectives. After we've done that, we'll look at the critical theories of international relations and global politics, focusing on Marxism, dependency theory, world systems theory, constructivism, and feminism. And we'll look at these theories because they challenge the dominance of realism and liberalism by emphasizing inequality, identity, social structures, gender, and global power relations. Now, let's start off by defining theory. What is theory? Now, the main idea, or should I say, when we talk about theory, it is a set of ideas and concepts that explain how things happen, why they happen, and it helps to predict future behavior. So, the key ideas that come from a theory is that it helps to generate hypotheses. You find that tested hypotheses strengthens theories, that theories help to simplify and explain complex global events, and that in international relations, theories explain patterns of international politics. It should be noted that another important concept that's added to this idea of theory is that of a paradigm, which is a broad framework of beliefs that shape how people interpret the world. So when you look at it, a theory tends to be lenses that are used to understand world politics. So let's look at some of the major international relations or global politics theories. Now, there are three major traditions within international relations and global politics. These are realism, liberalism, and Marxism. But in this section, we'll kind of start off by discussing realism and liberalism. Now, the difference between realism, liberalism, and Marxism is what their main focus tend to be. So with the realism, the focus tends to be on power and security. With liberalism, it also tends to be, or shouldn't say, it tends to be focused on morality and cooperation. While with Marxism, the focus tends to be on economics and class. So we'll start off with a discussion on realism. What is realism? The core idea is that international politics is a struggle for power and survival in a dangerous world. So the main assumption of realism is that states are the main actors, that they dominate international politics, and that all other actors, that is, non-governmental organizations, international governmental organizations, and corporations, are less important. Second is that national interest comes first. They note that leaders must protect national power and security. Then, of course, there's a whole discussion about international anarchy, that they believe that there's no world government that exists above states and that states must rely on themselves. The major thinker from this school is that of Thomas Hobbes. He argued that authority would be, that life without authority would be solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. So you find that realism explains the international system as being competitive and insecure. Now, the essentials of realism are as follows: that of statism, where states are sovereign and government maintain order internally. It's based on the idea of survival as well, that this is the primary goal of every state. It is based on power politics, where states will compete for power and security, and that it's built on zero-sum thinking, that one state's gain will mean another state's loss. It's also built on the principle of self-help. Self-help basically is the argument that states cannot depend on others for security, and it's also built on this other concept of security dilemma, meaning that when states increase security, others will feel threatened. So, for example, if one country is having a military buildup, this may trigger an arms race. It's also built on the principle of balance of power. Now, when we talk about balance of power, realists believe that stability depends on balancing power among states. So, of course, there's different state systems. You could have a bipolar system, like what we saw during the Cold War, where you had the USSR versus the United States. That was a bipolar power system. You could have a multipolar system, which is said to be our current world system, where the United States have power here, China has a little power, Japan has power, the Middle East. So there are these different points of power across the world. Or it could be a unipolar system where there's one dominant hegemon, as in the case during the colonialist and imperialist era, that was Britain. And in the early 1990s, right after the end of the Cold War, that was the United States. Now, there are said to be different types of realism. So first we have classical realism, which argued that human nature drives conflict, that people naturally seek power. The main thinkers from this group were Machiavelli and Thomas Hobbes. Then we have what is called the structural or neoliberal school, neo-realist school, that they believe that conflict comes from this anarchic international system itself, because there's no world government above it, and that states compete because the system forces them to. Then, of course, there's something known as offensive realism, where they noted that states seek maximum power. The goal is to become the dominant hegemon. Then you have the defensive realism, where states mainly seek security and sovereignty. Now, the main criticism of realism would be that it's too focused on conflict and power. It ignores morality and cooperation. It treats states as similar actors, and it underestimates international institutions. So when you look at it, you find that realism tends to be too pessimistic. On the other side is liberalism. Now, the core principle of realism is that of cooperation, law, trade, and democracy, that these combined can reduce conflict and create peace. The origins of liberalism came from Europe during the 17th and 18th century and during the Enlightenment period. The major influences include expansion of global trade, scientific reasoning, and the belief in human progress. So they argue, or the main key assumption is that humans are basically rational and capable of cooperation. The key liberal thinkers are Immanuel Kant, John Locke, Adam Smith, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and Woodrow Wilson. The main ideas of liberalism are as follows. They argue that cooperation is possible, that states can work together through diplomacy, institutions, trade, and law, and that international institutions matter. Organizations help to maintain peace. Examples of these organizations tend to be the United Nations and the World Trade Organization. Another major principle is that democracy promotes peace. We have what is known as the democratic peace theory, where they argue that democracies are less likely to fight one another. The liberal argument is basically this, that wealth and trade reduces the incentives for war, and that basically economic interdependence promotes stability. Now we have something called liberal internationalism, where this combines democracy, free trade, multilateral cooperation, human rights, and rule-based international order. And this is used to explain how liberalism influenced the creation of the United Nations after World War II. Now, liberalism after the World Wars. After World War I, we saw where Woodrow Wilson promoted the League of Nations, self-determination, and collective security. After World War II, we saw where the world created the United Nations and other international organizations, and we saw where global institutions help to encourage cooperation. Another thing that we find that liberalism tends to promote is that of integration and interdependence. Now, integration theory simply argues that cooperation in one area will spread to others. For example, the European Union began through economic cooperation. And then when we talk about independence, it argues that states, as they become more interdependent, connected economically and politically, that this would reduce any chance of there being any wars. So these are some of the things that come up as we discuss liberalism. Now, just like how we have neorealism, we have what is known as neoliberalism. Now, neoliberalism is in response, or was in response, to neorealism. Neoliberals accept that anarchy exists, that states matter, and that competition exists. But they, however, argue that cooperation is still possible. That the role of international regimes are as follows: that institutions help to share information, encourage reciprocity, and they tend to punish any rule breakers. Now, the major criticism that we have of the liberal school is that liberal institutions may favor powerful Western states. We find that international organizations can create inequality and that some institutions lack democracy. So an example is that of the criticisms that have been made of the International Monetary Fund and the structural adjustment programs that came from it, where it's tended to push Western ideals on countries in the global south that was borrowing from the IMF. And at the same time, their proposals did not encourage true development, but actually made underdevelopment worse in some of these countries. So it expanded this inequality. Now, of course, there's other forms of liberalism. We have what is known as radical liberalism, one that may promote cosmopolitan democracy, where some liberals argue that global democracy should expand through stronger regional organizations and global human rights courts, as well as through democratic global institutions. Example of this is that what we saw developed as we saw the European grow over time. Now, if we're to compare realism and liberalism, it would be as follows: that how they view human nature is that realism sees human nature as being selfish and liberalism sees humans as being cooperative. The main goal for realism is survival and power, while for liberalism is peace and cooperation. The main actors in realism are states, and in liberalism it's states, institutions, and NGOs. In the international system, the realists view it as being anarchic, and that this built on conflict, while liberals will see that there's interdependence and cooperation, and how they view change is very different. Realists sees change as being difficult, while liberals see it as possible and desirable. So when we look at liberalism and realism, the main idea I want you to get from it is that so far, these theories help to explain global political behavior, that realism emphasizes power, survival, and conflict, while liberalism emphasizes cooperation, democracy, and institutions. And with that, we know that realism and liberalism offer competing but complementary ways of understanding global politics, one emphasizing power and survival, and the other emphasizing cooperation and progress. Now, as we move on to discussing the theories or the alternative or critical theories of global politics, I'll just kind of refresh your mind of what these tend to be. They are the Marxist school, dependency theory, world systems theory, constructivism, and feminism. And they actually challenge the dominance of realism and liberalism by emphasizing, as I said before, inequality, identity, social structures, gender, and historical political relations. But why should we even consider studying these alternative theories? The main reason is that realism and liberalism do not fully explain global politics. So we find that critical theories matter because they expose the weaknesses of mainstream theories. We find that realism and liberalism failed to predict the collapse of the USSR and the end of the Cold War. And as we mentioned before, these critical theories focus on inequality, identity, culture, class, and gender. So we find that when we include critical theories, it broadens our understanding of world politics beyond power and corporation. So let's start off by talking about Marxism. So the core idea of Marxism is that global politics is driven mainly by economic forces and class conflict. Some of the main assumptions are that economic structures shape politics, meaning that economic systems determine political and social relations. Another assumption is that history matters, that historical development explains global political inequalities. They also argue that capitalism drives conflict, that competition for economic power causes war and exploitation, and that the states represent capitalist interests, that governments protect capitalist elites rather than society as a whole. So what we kind of get from the Marxist school are the concepts of materialist conception of history, where economic development is seen as the engine of history. It also is built on the idea of class conflict, where the two main classes that they discuss is that of the bourgeoisie, which are the owners of the factors of production, and the proletariat, that tends to be the working class. So the Marxist argument tends to be that capitalism naturally creates exploitation and inequality. So when we think about this idea about even Marxism and globalization, from the Marxist perspective, they basically argue that globalization spreads capitalism worldwide. Some key ideas are that capitalism expands internationally, workers become increasingly exploited, and global inequality deepens. Karl Marx himself argued that the point is to change the world. So when you look at Marxism, it is not just descriptive, but it seeks social transformation. And from this school, we actually have two major critical theories that come out of Marxism, that of the dependency school and the world system school. So I'm going to start off by describing or discussing the main arguments coming from the dependency theory. Now, the core idea of the dependency theory is that poor countries remain underdeveloped because rich countries exploited them. When we look at imperialism, the major thinker that came from this school is Vladimir Lenin. In his work, Imperialism and the Highest Stage of Capitalism, Lenin argued that capitalism evolved into monopoly capitalism and that the wealthy core countries exploited the poorer periphery countries. So we have like a two-tiered system between the rich core and the poor periphery. So what's the core versus the periphery? As I mentioned, at the core, it tends to have rich industrialized countries who control wealth and technology and benefit from trade. And at the periphery, which tend to be countries that are in the global south or developing countries, they are poor developing countries that export raw material and remain dependent. So you find that the main argument is that global capitalism benefits wealthy states while keeping poorer states dependent. Another thing that the dependency theory was very good at explaining is the issue of underdevelopment. A major thinker under this school was Raúl Prebisch, who was a part of the Latin American Dependencia school. And their argument is that you'd always see decline in terms of trade, meaning that manufactured goods that were coming from the global north would be more expensive than the raw materials that were coming from the global south. They tended to be cheap. So no matter how much goods the global south will sell, because of how cheap it is versus manufactured goods coming from the global north, that developing countries will become poorer relative to rich countries. So that's one of the major arguments that come from there. Then we have what is known as world systems theory, which, you know, a lot of people don't talk much about today, but it still had a major impact because it's one of the first theories that tackled globalization head on. The major thinker from this school was Immanuel Wallerstein, and he argued that the world operated as one capitalist system. That when you look at this system, it's actually built on three levels, where you have the core, the periphery, and the semi-periphery countries. Now he notes that at the core, that is where you'd have the wealthy, technologically advanced countries. In the semi-periphery, you'd have the industrializing middle powers, and at the periphery, you'd have the poor, dependent economies. So, for example, at the core, he'd include the US and Western Europe. In the semi-periphery, that would include Brazil and South Africa and even the Asian tigers. And at the periphery, that would include many of the countries that are in the global south. Under the world systems theory, they actually note the issue of exploitation as well. They say that wealth flows from the periphery to the core, similar to the dependency school, but they note that it goes from the periphery to the semi-periphery to the core. The effects of this are as follows: that core countries accumulate wealth, peripheral countries remain dependent, and that this exploitation creates instability and inequality. So we see from this effect that, according to the world systems theory, that globalization can actually reinforce unequal economic systems. Now, the other critical school we'll look at now is that of constructivism. Now, the core idea of constructivism is that international politics is socially constructed through ideas, norms, identity, and language. The main assumptions are as follows: that reality is socially constructed, that human interaction creates political reality. There's rules, norms, the idea that rules and norms matter, that shared ideas actually help to shape state behavior. They also note that identity shapes interest, that states act according to identities and beliefs, not material interests, and that anarchy is what the state makes of it. Sorry about that. So what is that? It means that the main thinker that came up with this was Alexander Wendt, and he argued that anarchy does not automatically lead to conflict, as the realist school argued, but states can actually choose to either choose cooperation, competition, or peaceful coexistence. So as I said, this is in contrast to the realist assumption that anarchy will always lead to insecurity. They also talk a lot about institutions and discursive power, where the constructivists argue that institutions gain power through material resources, but also through the control of ideas and language. So the idea of sovereignty, human rights, and even global norms are something that helps to shape who has power. So they mention that ideas can shape world politics just as much as military and economic power. So they also talk a lot about change as well. How does ideas help to change rules, right? So what they note is that norms and identities can change over time. That, for example, we've seen where changing global attitudes towards colonialism, slavery, human rights, and even gender equality has affected how states operate at the global level. So for them, they note that they tend to focus on how these international norms evolve over time. So of course, we'll move on to trying to compare Marxism with constructivism, right? So when we look at this discussion about, what are the main foci of Marxism and constructivism, is that we find that the main focus of Marxism is economics and class, while with constructivism is ideas and identity. For Marxism, the source of power is capitalism. For constructivism, this is norms and discourse. In Marxism, the main actors are the classes and the elites, while for constructivism, it's states and social actors. In the cause of conflict, it tends to be economic exploitation, while with constructivism, it tends to be socially constructed interests. And for Marxism, change happens through revolution, while for constructivism, they note that change, that it happens when the norms actually changes as well. So those are the two first critical schools that we would focus on. We'll end by looking at feminism. Now, when it comes to feminism, what is feminism? Now, according to feminism, global politics is shaped by gender relations and unequal power between men and women. For them, some key concepts that come up is that of sex versus gender. Sex, really, the meaning is focused on biological differences, while gender is about socially constructed roles. So the feminist argument tends to be that international politics has historically been shaped around male experiences and priorities. Like all other theories, there are subfields within feminism. So we'll start off by looking at liberal feminism. The main focus of liberal feminism is equal rights and opportunities for women. So the key arguments are that women are excluded from political power, states and institutions are gendered, and traditional international relations ignored women's contributions. So you find that this school tends to discuss women's underrepresentation in places of leadership and diplomacy. Then we have the socialist and the Marxist feminism. The Marxist feminism, their argument tends to be that women's inequality comes mainly from capitalism, while for the socialist feminist school, they note that oppression comes from both capitalism and patriarchy. So for these two schools of feminism, they know that economic systems and male dominance work together to oppress women. Then there's also a third school, which is that of post-colonial feminism. The main focus of this school is the intersection of gender, race, class, and colonial history. The main arguments tend to be that Western feminism ignore or may ignore women in the global South. They also note that global economic systems affect women differently across regions, and speaking for oppressed groups can become what they call cultural imperialism. So the main point of the post-colonial school is to explain that experiences of women differ globally. So when looking at the critical school, I want you guys to kind of have three main takeaways. That the critical theories challenge mainstream IR approaches, that Marxism focuses on capitalism and inequality, and that constructivism and feminism emphasizes ideas, identities, and social structures. With that, I will end with saying that critical theories in global politics challenges us to look beyond military power and state interests by examining how economics, ideas, identity, and gender shape the international system. Thank you.